Final point I wanted to make around testing. We've talked a lot about this and automated testing. I don't need to talk about this, which will be evident to you. But when we look at the history of software and the massive leaps and bounds that software development has made over the last two and a half decades, basically, without automated testing, Agile wouldn't have existed, CI/CD wouldn't have existed. Automated testing is one of the underpinning principles. But it also enables something new and something that's still in the process of gaining favor in the software world. That's the concept of test-driven development. So the way I describe the use case is I got a requirement from the user in an email. I built some functionality for it. And once I was happy with the functionality, I then wrote some tests for it. And that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. The test-driven development approach turns that on its head and say, right, before I write any functional code, let me write the test. So before I go and write any of that model, let me sit down and write the test file. And actually, when I first went through this, because this was a sort of a semi-real example, I didn't put any not null constraints on total lifetime value, and I didn't put it on minutes that's last order. And actually what happened was the results of the model that came out of this had a whole bunch of blank customers. And why? Because in this data set, it's possible for a customer to sign up before placing an order. So although they had all of the customers that had placed orders, they also had hundreds of customers with null lifetime order values and null minutes since last order. If you think about it, eyeballing it, it would have been very easy for stakeholders to look at it. The first 100 rows look sensible. It's only 1 or 2 weeks later that they start saying, well, hang on, why have I got these sort of weird gaps in my pie charts or whatever on my BI reports? Or why are my distributions looking funny? The answer is because there's a whole bunch of null customers in there. Oh, well, I didn't want null customers. I didn't want customers in here that hadn't placed orders yet. Okay, well, that wasn't part of your requirement. Oh, well, I didn't think about it. Now, you may well have solved that with the iterative process of the stakeholder anyway. But what test-driven development does is force you to think about the characteristics of the system you're building, the functional requirements, in a very, very rigorous way. So actually, the value of test-driven development is not writing the tests ahead of time. It's the fact that the action of writing these tests forces you to think about, when I got to this point, I would have thought, okay, can I put a not null criteria in here? I don't know. Is it okay to have a null customer? Let me look at the data. Well, null customers would exist. Does the stakeholder want that? I don't know. Let me go back and ask them. Those discussions would always have happened. With test-driven development, there's a far higher chance of those happening ahead of time before I sit down and write some code, which saves me time. And most importantly, it means that it hasn't been in the field for 2 or 3 weeks before someone notices it. This is something we've been talking about internally as we come to decompose these big stored procedures. This is very much the approach we'll be taking. We'll be looking at a piece of code and saying, okay, how does it work? In many ways, as a way of us documenting how it works, we'll write the tests for it. And we'll say, okay, the output of this model must meet all of the following test criteria. And that will form a record of what it is that we are going to build to. And then we'll actually build the functionality that meets these tests. So this is just a sidebar. You don't have to do this. If the system works perfectly well, building the functionality, building the test, but we found this to be a very interesting way of thinking of the world. Test-driven development forces a thought process in a slightly different order that very, very often is a lot more efficient. And effectively, then test-driven development becomes part of your plan stage. Your plan is not take an email from a stakeholder and start building it. Your plan is take an email from a stakeholder, spend half an hour thinking about writing the test, bounce that off the stakeholder, have a 15-minute review session with them, and then be much more confident that I'm going to go around this loop less times. And when I do go around this loop and I'm happy with it, what I've got actually meets what the business ultimately needs.